Welcome to the Waterloo podcast. My name is Martin Aaron. Since the year 2000, I've been building a database of the British Army at Waterloo. By compiling original records from the Public Record Office and regimental archives, I've gathered information about each of the 33,000 British combatants in 1815. This podcast series examines that data. Welcome to episode 23. This week we're looking at Sandham's battery of the Royal Artillery. This was number 9 company of the 3rd Battalion. I should say here at the beginning that I use the terms battery and company interchangeably. They refer to the same thing, 6 guns and 100 or so gunners. It's a bit of a shorter episode this time, with just 104 all ranks in the battery. That's around a fifth or sixth of a typical cavalry or infantry unit. Obviously, there's not so much to cover. Another reason is that, compared to the other units, sources are scarce. Where previously we've been able to include first-hand accounts as well as portraits of some of the men present, nothing exists for Sandham's battery. In fact, the only substantial witness account we have comes from the commander of a neighbouring battery, from Major Coolman, who commanded a horse artillery battery of the King's German Legion, brigaded with Sandham. For this, I'm grateful to this collection of German sources put together by Gareth Glover. Now, it might seem a little strange that so little is known about Sandham's battery, but as I'll be suggesting in this episode, there might be an intriguing reason why so little was written. As usual, we'll break up the episode into 3 parts. First, a look at who these men were and their previous experiences of campaigning, then their experience in 1815, and finally we'll look at what became of some of these men in the years that followed. So, let's get started and first find out where these men were from. Of 99 other ranks, there's birthplace data for 90%, 67 English, 15 Scottish, 6 Irish and 1 foreigner. On paper, our foreign-born man, Corporal Andrew Clark, was from Gibraltar, although he was actually of Scottish stock and had enlisted at Cooper in Fifeshire. In terms of counties, there's not the kind of regional concentrations you find in infantry and cavalry units, with a spread from across the British Isles. But, as we've seen is common, the industrial north was often a major source of recruits, and provided over a quarter of the men in this battery, with 18 from Lancashire and 10 from Yorkshire. Next, in 3rd place, the agricultural east, with 6 men from Suffolk, and then from the Scottish contingent, 5 men were from Fifeshire. For age, there's a date of birth for 69 of the men, and this gives a median of 1786, so that would be 29 years old in 1815. The oldest man was the company sergeant John Oliver from Winkle in Cheshire, who was born in 1767 and thus aged around 48 at Waterloo. Almost half of the men with a birth rate recorded were aged 30 or above. Of the 5 officers, Sandham was 33 in 1815. Second Captain Stopford was 27. Lieutenants Foote and Baines were 26 and 25 respectively, while Second Lieutenant Jago was just 20. For enlistment date, there is data for 97 of the 99 men. So you can see this graph here. The most common date of joining up was 1803, with a median date of 1806. So an average 9 years experience for the men of this battery at Waterloo. The company had been abroad twice before, having seen action in the expedition to Copenhagen in 1807 and in the disastrous Walcheren expedition of 1809. Some of the men at Waterloo were still suffering from sporadic bouts of the shivering ague, which had caused such devastation among the British Army on that campaign. The company had not served in the peninsula, but with transfers between units being common in the artillery, there were among Sandham's men a few who had seen action in Portugal and Spain. Gunner John Barlow from Rolleston, Staffordshire, for example, had been wounded in the neck at Badajoz by a shell splinter. One other thing we know about Sandham's men is that 14 of them were accompanied by their wives on this Waterloo campaign. Only a limited number were allowed to embark on campaign with their husbands. Corporals and bombardiers were given priority, and lots were drawn for the remaining 8 allocations. You can see the 14 men here. So, as we've said, the battery was commanded by 5 officers. It's likely that Stopford and the 2 lieutenants oversaw the firing of 2 guns each, with Sandham in overall command, and young Jago probably dealing with supplies of ammunition. As with all the British foot artillery at Waterloo, they were armed with 5 9-pounder cannons and 1 5.5-inch howitzer. Sandham was in turn under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Adye. Apparently that's the pronunciation, although it's spelt A-D-Y-E, who oversaw both Sandham's battery and Kuhlmann's troop of the King's German Legion Horse Artillery. These 2 batteries were attached to the 1st British Division, that is the Foot Guards, and were positioned in front of the huge squares of the 1st Foot Guards at Waterloo. Being an officer in the Royal Artillery was often a family tradition. Sandham came from a long line of artillery officers, and Lieutenant George Baines was brother to Captain Henry Baines, who was the brigade major for the Royal Artillery at Waterloo. Captain Stopford also had a brother at Waterloo, Edward Stopford, acting as ADC to Major General Byng of the Guards Brigade, and their father was a Lieutenant General. Now that we know a little about the officers and men, let's join them in 1815. Despite what's written in many histories of the campaign, Sandham's battery was actually present at Quatre Bras, but for some reasons does not seem to have been heavily engaged, if at all. We simply just don't know. At Waterloo, the battery was positioned in the centre of the Allied artillery line, which ran between Hougemont and La Haye-Sainte, squeezed between Kuhlmann and Lloyd, and fired from this position for most of the day. I really like this plan of the battle, produced in 1896 by 2 historians, the Reverend D.H. Parry, who created it, with R. Simpkin as the artist. I like it because it gives such a striking impression of how the various units were squeezed into such a small area. It is, however, a product of its time, and shows Sandham's battery positioned here between Lloyd to its left, which is correct, and Bolton's battery, which is incorrect. Kuhlmann's German troop has been omitted entirely. One can sympathise with the Reverend to some extent, because the sources available at the time were nearly all of a narrowly Anglo-centric jingoistic bent. Here, for example, is the map in the main source available in the day, and it should be said is still probably the most useful source for any history of the British at Waterloo, the letters compiled by William Silborne. It's this map, compiled by Silborne, that the Reverend Parry was doubtless copying. Silborne had actually received a letter from Captain Kuhlmann, but chose not only to not publish it alongside the British letters, but to remove Kuhlmann's battery entirely from this map and from history. It seems almost laughable now. Fortunately, such omissions can now be corrected. Here again is the map we looked at in the previous episodes by the historian Nick Lipscomb, produced here with his kind permission. I've just added a bit of highlighting to show Sandham more clearly. And we can see Sandham positioned between Lloyd and Kuhlmann. If you've listened to previous episodes, you'll know by now that the battle began with heavy bombardment by the massed French artillery batteries. According to legend, it was in fact Sandham's battery which fired the first shot of the day, although predictably other batteries claimed that honour as their own. Wellington had given specific instruction that his guns should not attempt to engage in an artillery duel with their French counterparts, but instead should only fire on their designated targets along the French line. This order seems to have been ignored, and there are accounts from more than one British artillery unit which describe firing at French guns which were tormenting them. Sir John Bloomfield was near Wellington in his capacity as an artillery staff officer, and remembers that the Duke saw a French gun struck by a shot from one of the English batteries, and was furious that his orders had been disobeyed. Under the impression that the shot had come from Sandham's battery, he sent orders to have Captain Sandham placed under arrest. Bloomfield states, however, that this was not done, saying only some satisfactory explanation having been given. Throughout the afternoon, during the repeated attacks of French cavalry, the battery was enveloped by the enemy horsemen. On each occasion, the gunners would run for the safety of the nearby infantry squares. However, towards evening, both Sandham and Kuhlmann's batteries were attacked in their left flank by cuirassiers and thrown back in confusion. We should discuss now an extraordinary letter written 6 months after Waterloo by the Duke of Wellington. That he had long had a rocky relationship with the whole Ordnance Department is well known, and too large a topic to go into here. Perhaps we can come back to it in a future episode, but what is key for us today is this private letter which he wrote in December 1815, but which only came to light nearly 60 years after the battle in 1872.
To tell you the truth, I was not very well pleased with the artillery in the Battle of Waterloo. The army was formed in squares immediately on the slope of the rising ground, on the summit of which the artillery was placed, with orders not to engage with artillery, but to fire only when bodies of troops came under their fire. It was very difficult to get them to obey this order.
So, as we've already heard, Wellington was frustrated by various Allied guns ignoring his orders to not become embroiled in duels with their French counterparts. This was well documented, but what follows in the letter came as a shocking revelation.
The French cavalry charged and were formed on the same ground with our artillery in general, within a few yards of our guns. In some instances they were in actual possession of our guns. We could not expect the artillerymen to remain at their guns in such a case, but I had a right to expect that the officers and men of the artillery would do as I did, and as all the staff did. That is, to take shelter in the squares of the infantry till the French cavalry should be driven off the ground, either by our cavalry or infantry. But they did no such thing. They ran off the field entirely, taking with them limbers, ammunition and everything. And when in a few minutes we had driven off the French cavalry and had regained our ground and our guns, and could have made good use of our artillery, we had no artillerymen to fire them. And in point of fact, I should have had no artillery during the whole of the latter part of the action if I had not kept a reserve in the commencement.
So, what an extraordinary thing. We have no accounts from Sandham's battery, but Major Kuhlmann, commanding the neighbouring battery, leaves a very clear account which is packed full of intriguing details and provides key support to Wellington's claim of several batteries running away to the rear.
The enemy cavalry fell on our left flank and forced us to retreat, the 2 batteries under Lieutenant Colonel Ady's command. It was only at some distance to the rear that my battery was able to locate somewhat empty space, free of retreating troops and wagons, where other batteries had already halted, and where it was possible to put everything in order to the extent that circumstances permitted, which was indeed a time-consuming process.
So it seems both batteries were away from the front line for a considerable time. Kuhlmann then relates how his German battery was then joined by Sandham's, which, he says, had retreated even further to the rear, being led up, perhaps like naughty schoolboys, by Lieutenant Colonel Ady. Kuhlmann then tells us that even more time was spent in an exchange of ammunition. He says it was necessary for his battery to be resupplied by Sandham's because Sandham's guns, had fired less at Quatre Bras. This is an interesting detail and seems to suggest that Sandham's battery had been in action to some extent on the 16th of June, although perhaps firing only a few rounds. Another intriguing detail can be found in Kuhlmann's remark that their pell-mell retreat to the rear came to a halt where other batteries had already halted. So who were these batteries? If Sandham's guns had run even further to the rear, then who were the other batteries who had limbered up and ridden off? By the time Sandham and Kuhlmann had finished putting everything in order and exchanging ammunition supplies and returned to the line, the battle was already over.
By the time of our arrival in the battle line, the fortunes of this day had already favoured our side, because the enemy was on the retreat.
Again, this corresponds with Wellington's angry lines that he would have had no artillery at all at the crucial moment of the final French attack had he not kept a reserve. In response to the publication of Wellington's letter, the poor artillery was deeply hurt, and the following year, 1873, a regimental history set out to counter this scurrilous accusation by citing numerous witnesses to the various batteries' valiant conduct throughout the day. The author, Francis Duncan, quotes a number of high-ranking British officers who, after the battle, had commended the bravery and fortitude of the artillery unit attached to their division or stationed to their front. General Cahoon Grant is quoted praising Webber-Smith's troop, while Lord Rowland Hill is quoted praising the KGL troop of Simfer and the Royal Artillery Battery of Bolton. Sir James Kempt praises the Battery of Rogers and the Hanoverian Battery of Heiser, while Sir George Wood singles out the conduct of Lloyd's battery as being conspicuous to the whole army. Perhaps tellingly, however, there is no mention of either Sandham's battery nor Coolman's. So those unfortunately are the only details we have, that the 6 guns fired all day, that during the massed French cavalry attacks the men of all the batteries ran for cover within the infantry squares, yet somehow an attack late in the day sent Coolman and Sandham's batteries to the rear in confusion. Personally, I find it difficult to understand the mechanics of this retreat. I can see how French cuirassiers could, as reported by Coolman, have come up unexpectedly from the left flank, from the directions of the crossroads and the farmhouse of La Haye Sainte. No doubt the amount of smoke from so much cannon and musket fire meant visibility was extremely poor, but I have difficulty imagining how there would have been time to limber up the guns and retreat with them to the rear. Surely, if, as we're told, the artillerymen had run to the sanctuary of the squares on the advance of every other attack by the French horsemen, then they would have done the same now. It's perplexing. Another mystery is that there were so few casualties in this battery. Here's Sandham's muster in July 1815 listing changes to the battery's personnel. It shows 2 men killed, Bombardier William McLaughlin and Gunner William Gamble. That's it. Bombardier James Thompson is listed as deceased on the 27th of July, which might mean died of wounds, but could also be died of some other cause. 4 men are listed as sick, which on other artillery musters indicates wounded. One other man, Gunner Henry Walton, is initially listed as missing, but later this is changed to presumed killed. So that's 3 men officially recorded as killed and 3 wounded, 2 missing, later assumed dead. 5 fatalities and 3 wounded. It seems a strangely low casualty rate for a unit positioned in the front row of the Allied line all day. By comparison, have a look at the 1st Foot Guards positioned just a short distance behind Sandham's battery. On my Excel spreadsheet I use red for killed or died of wounds and pink for wounded. So here's a random section, and at a glance compare this with Sandham's battery. And here's a random snippet from the next square over, the 30th Cambridgeshire Foot. You can see a stark difference in the casualties. And a final observation, one which I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, that this is the only battery for which no witness accounts exist. I say none, but there is one very brief letter from Sandham. This was his reply to the circular sent out by William Silborne, asking officers to locate their position on a map of the battlefield in the early evening, 18th of June.
I have endeavoured to mark as nearly as I could the position of my battery, and believe I have nothing more to add about the time alluded to in your circular, when it was charged by a column of cuirassiers. Colonel Adey, who commanded the artillery of the 1st Division, was with the battery the whole of the day, and from whom it received its orders has probably been able to afford you fuller information.
So that's that. A single line that mentions they were charged by cuirassiers. Nothing else. Imagine if we didn't have Major Coolman's account, and if the Duke of Wellington's letter had remained hidden away. This one sentence from Sandham would be all we had. About this time it was charged by a column of cuirassiers. We'd know nothing about the retreat to the rear, nothing about the length of time spent lingering there, and be completely unaware that both batteries, and perhaps others, were absent for the later part of the day, including for the final attack of the French Imperial Guard. Without those 2 sources, we'd be left wondering why Wellington seemed to have some bee in his bonnet with the artillery. There were hints to be found elsewhere, but it was unclear what the specific issue might be. And we'd be puzzling over the low casualty rate and wondering how sheer providence had spared all of the battery's officers from even being wounded. If we look at all the batteries of the Royal Artillery at Waterloo, it's clear that certainly Lloyd and Bolton were heavily engaged, at least in comparison to Sandham. As we've heard in previous episodes, the Royal Artillery was drastically scaled down in the peace following the end of the war. Most men were sent on their way with a pension. A quarter of the men in Sandham's battery were discharged within a year of Waterloo, and another quarter gone by the end of 1819. In that year, the battery was reduced, that is, it was disbanded, and the remaining 40 or so men were transferred into other battalions. Of these, many would serve in Ceylon, and we heard last time in the episode on the 73rd Foot what a death sentence that posting could be. 5 Waterloo men from Sandham's battery were to die in Ceylon, as many as had lost their lives in 1815. Gunners Sam Parkinson from Millthorpe, Westmoreland, William Longfellow from Wigan, George Waddle from Sunderland, William Fell from Barnoldswick, Yorkshire, and John Practice from Clackmannan. Some of the survivors of Ceylon went on to a safer posting in Canada. Gunner Joseph Lightfoot from Stoke, for example, who served there from 1829 to 1836. Let's finish now by hearing what became of some of the men of the battery in later life. We heard earlier of Gunner Barlow, wounded in the neck by a shell splinter at Badajoz. Well, in 1844, aged 57, he was admitted to Royal Hospital Chelsea to be an in-pensioner, his application accompanied by a letter of recommendation from Sandham. Extraordinarily, at the time of Gunner Barlow being admitted as an in-pensioner at Chelsea, there was one man from Sandham's battery still serving. Gunner William Devlin from Desert Crete in County Tyrone would have been 28 in 1815 and had previously seen actions in the Netherlands in 1814. In 1830, aged 43, he was transferred to the Royal Artillery Invalid Detachment, a unit which served the same purpose as trusted old steeds seeing out their days in pasture. And, incredibly, he remained in this detachment until 1848, when he was 61. His conduct was described as exemplary, and he was commended for his temperate habits. The youngest officer in the battery, Darrell Jago, was the first of the officers to pass away at Plymouth in 1850. The remaining 4 lived into the late 1860s or early 1870s, dying within 6 years of each other. Stopford, who rose to become a full colonel, died at the very respectable age of 80 in 1868. Sandham was next, dying at Roldal, Sussex, the following year, aged 87. And the 2 first lieutenants lived into the 1870s, both dying in 1874, George Foote at Plymouth, and 2 days later, George Baines at Guernsey. So, let's leave Sandham's battery there. I hope you found it interesting. I'll be back soon, and next up we're going to have a look at another brigade of cavalry, of Grant's brigade, and first up will be Lord Uxbridge's own regiment, the 7th Hussars. So I hope you'll join me for that. See you soon.